Hey folks, welcome back. So today is going to be kind of an initial review of the new WE Glock Gen 5, the G19. Now, this isn't, I haven't, had this for very long. I've had it for only about a month so far. And so I've just kind of been, kind of been shooting it quite a bit, and I've been trying to more look at the features, right? It's going to be a little bit tougher to necessarily talk about the durability or the long-term results of this gun until because have had it for a very long time. But at least we can talk about those things, and then in like a follow-up video, we can say, hey, how's it been doing? So anyway, right off the bat, this is it. This is the official, well, not official, but you know what I mean, right? It's the WeTech Glock 19. Now it's a Gen 5. So what's different, right? As you can tell, all Glocks really are, the G series are pretty much the same. But with the Gen 5, there's some new upgrades. So for one thing, right off the bat, this one comes off with the full trades. They don't all do that, but certain stores will sell them with the full initial trades on the slide. Although not completely, because on the lower frame you won't see the official Glock logo. You see kind of the generic WE logo down here. And then of course on the side, in the Gen 5 models, they move the logos on the side, which typically looks something like this. You got your made in Austria, Glock Inc., Smyrna, Georgia. That label is typically on top, and this is down here the serial number. But with this, the Gen 5 model, this is accurate. They don't have it in here, and they'll have their move down here. But again, these are more of like the mock logos because they're typically made in Austria, not in Taiwan, like this one here. But they were true to some of the parts where you see the Glock logo on the side, as well on the top of the barrel right there. And remember, this is actually an interesting part right here because many of the WE models, they do not put that logo there. It's often filled in with kind of like this funky symbol here. This is a Gen 4 G19 by WE, not fully trade, obviously. But that one comes with that part right here. It's been they pretty much don't, even on their more adequately trademark arm pieces, they don't have that there. So this is a nice change to see right there. Now I don't know if across the board they'll have this, but that is something that is an available option. So the first thing you'll probably notice, or at least if you haven't, you will notice it now, is the first change in the Glock series is, of course, the lack of the finger grooves right here. This is something that in the real history of the real steel, the 9mm form, a lot of folks are really complaining about the finger grooves. And so this is a Glock 19 here. This is actually an Elite Force Glock 17, sorry. They come with these finger grooves at the bottom here. And for about, like, I don't know how many percent of the population out there, the shooters, I think, let's just say it's 95, 90, maybe 80% of the population, that finger groove there will be sufficient, For me, it works. My finger fits the average person size. The average shooter will be able to fit there and grab that, and it will work. And so to me, I think it's very comfortable. But of course, if you have larger finger width, and if, for example, instead of landing in between these grooves, right, you land on the grooves, that can be very uncomfortable. And some people actually have to resort to sanding these grooves off to shoot the real steel at a more comfortable rate. Now, what's interesting is that these grooves were installed into the later generations, like the Gen 3s and onwards, and then stopped at Gen 5. But originally in the Gen 2s, and I believe the Gen 1 Glocks, they didn't have that. And so in a way, Glock went from going to the finger grooves in the earlier generation, installed the grooves. A couple of generations later, they realized no one, or a lot of people were complaining about that, and so they took that off. And now we're going backwards in time, really, or a regression in design to go back to this straight grip right here. Now, what do I think of it, right? I honestly can't tell, and I've seen a lot of folks who shoot the Gen 5 Glock and they compare it, and they're not really sure either now. Now of course if you hate it from the very get-go, then that's gonna be your cup of tea. But For someone who was never bothered by the finger grooves, now that it's not there, it's not really a big deal for me because, again, my hands fitted perfectly in the old platform. It wasn't a problem. With the new one, I was kind of concerned that maybe it wouldn't fit as nicely, but no, it's not a big deal. So to me, I think it's fine that you would probably go with this groove or this grooveless thing. Totally fine. Boy, that was a lot of time talking about that, huh? All right, anyway, moving on. It's going to come with the traditional back straps that you can install back here. Ooh, I took that away here. I'll take a picture and show it in a little bit. But it'll come with the traditional back straps that comes back there. I think the default size is good enough. My hands aren't that large, to be honest with you, and so it will fit there nicely. But for those folks who have larger hands, who feel more comfortable, might want to install the two back straps, the different sizes that come with this gun. And that's not really a new feature. That's been available since the Gen 4 came out. Now, what's new though is this flared magazine well down here. So if you'll notice, this is a Gen 4 right here. Notice how it's straight and smooth down here, whereas with this one here, if you look here, it kind of curves up because it's flared out. Now, it might be a little bit hard to see, but if I turn it around like this way, you folks can see how the magazine well is a little bit smaller than this one right here, whereas since this one's flared, it's a little bit easier to put in a magazine. Now, how not clinically, but how relevant is this really, in practice? I honestly, it's a little dusty. I honestly don't think it makes that much of a difference. Glocks, I've reloaded before with this one, and I've tried this one. It doesn't make a huge difference. It doesn't hurt it in any way, of course, but it does make sense. It would be a little bit easier since you don't have to finagle to put in a magazine. But again, not a huge difference, but it's kind of a nice feature to see that is included. Another thing is they have this little cutout right here, so that if your magazine is jammed, you can kind of use your thumb as a kind of a holding place to pull out a magazine, or that if you were resorting to that situation. That wasn't a feature available here. Interestingly enough, though, a lot of folks online that are reviewing the Gen 5 Glock are actually complaining that their pinky kind of feels uncomfortable on this interruption right here. So that means probably the next generation, like the Gen 6 Glock, they're probably going to have it somewhere right here instead, or maybe back here. I don't know. We'll just see where they go from there. Magazine, it's an interesting thing here, but on the magazine down here, you notice that it's pretty much the same, but there's a little, it's kind of like a tapering of the lip here where it points up. Whereas with the old magazines, this is a G17 here, notice how it's kind of flat, right? So it's a little bit different. Not that it makes a huge difference. One thing that's kind of interesting though is this is a standard magazine right here, a G17. With the new Gen 5 Glock, the real steel, the 9mm ones, the follower, which is this part right here, is actually bright orange. So what happens is that when you run out of ammo, right, and you cycle the round back, you'll see the orange follower right here. It's clear as day, so that you're out of ammo and it's not like a malfunction that's causing it to slide to lock back. And that's actually, I heard it's because they copied Magpul. His Magpul is making generic Glock mags, and then once Glock came out of it, they decided, hey, that might be a good idea, and they started having orange followers. Of course, the WE version does not have that, but that would have been a nice touch if they were going to replicate everything. All right, moving on now. Okay, so anyway, back to what I was saying though is I had to pull the old back straps here. I just wanted to show you all right here. So these are the back straps, by the way. They don't have the trades on the back with this one right here, but they do serve the function of widening the grip angle, or the grips right here. And basically you have to punch this pin out in order to use this, but you would install it this way. So if you want this one, or you can try this one, they both have different sizes, and you can tell at the bottom because this one's a medium size, there's an M down there, and this one here is a L for the larger one. So basically it would look like that though. They'll be larger Of course, you can push it in there because you can pull that out. But those are the back straps that come standard with the Glock. Now, boy, this table's really dusty. It's really causing this gun to get dusty here. So anyway, real quick, so it's kind of interesting how Glock goes back in terms of their designs. So they'll reintroduce a new feature which they'll call an innovation. Then they'll backtrack and then go backwards to remove that to go back to an original form, and then call that another innovation, even though they're just undoing what they did. So it's kind of interesting. I kind of wonder what they're going to do. I doubt they're going to change this, but for example, something like this, this is where you mount flashlights and lasers, and that's a feature that wasn't really available in the earlier generations, like the Gen 2s and Gen 1 Glocks. So something like this is a Glock right here. I never really got a Glock 26. I never really got a clear idea whether it's like a Gen 2 or a Gen 1, partially because these came out a little bit later afterwards, and so I'm not really sure where it's classified as. But notice how there's none of the Glock 26 have this, but really they have the they don't really have a mounting spot for flashlights, and it used to look like that on these earlier generations as well. But then since mounting flashlights and lasers and stuff like that was helpful, they started including that. So I can't imagine that's going to change, but that seems like a good feature, right? That people will complain if they removed it, or they might just install it or take it out and then in the next generation put it back in and say it's another thing they've innovated on. Who knows? Stippling, notice how there's no stippling. There are finger grooves in this generation here, but there are no, there are finger grooves but no stippling, right? Whereas the third generation Glock 26 right here, notice that it still has the grooves but also has the stippling right there as well. So I wonder if the stippling on the grips might go at one point. It's just interesting to see how Glock has developed and changed their models throughout the years. Oh, I almost forgot, since I have the Glock 26 here, notice how there's this beveled, kind of a tapered contour towards the front of the gun right here on the Glock 26 models. That's the same with the older generations and the Gen 3 models here. I don't have a Gen 4, but I think they're also the same. That's typically only unique to the baby Glock series here. The subcompact and the full-size Glocks, i.e. the Glock 19s and Glock 17s, they don't have that. So here's a Glock 19 right here, and notice how it's like straight edge right there. It's kind of curved, or kind of like rounded off a little bit, but by and large it's pretty much a square. And here is another one. This is a Gen 4. This is a Glock 17. Same thing, right? And so they've introduced that bevel tapering sort of on the Gen 5 right here. And in some ways it helps when you're holstering the gun a little bit, because again it creates it's kind of like the reverse of this flared magazine well, right? So if you're narrowing the front edge right there, there's less places for it to catch on, so it would be able to slide into the holster a little bit better. I know there's a dying question for those folks who carry, like, say, the Black Hawk holsters, like, does this fit? I don't have the answer to that just yet, because I do not have an official, like, one of those Black Hawk holsters, so I can really try it to see if it works or not. Hopefully it does, but I'm not confident on that right now. Kind of an obvious thing, though, is an ambidextrous slide lock release right here. So notice how I'm actuating from this side right here, but I'm also able to actuate it from this side. So the slide is obviously cut in both sides so that you can actuate, or you can, basically you can actuate the slide lock like so. Now, I shoot left-handed with the Glocks, right? And this is a feature that would be nice because you can put your thumb down and release it forward. I however don't practice, or when I shoot, I don't really do that. I kind of just release a slide. And I talked to a lot of folks out there who fire the 9mm, and they've gotten the same habit of doing the same thing. They don't actuate the slide and release it using the slide stop, whether it's an ambidextrous slide lock or a slide release or non-ambi release. I heard it's just good practice. I don't know why. The guy who told me that was some serious gun guy, so I think he knows what he's talking about, but I don't know, to be honest with you, and I just kind of never really did it. In these models, however, there's a reason to do so, and it's that traditionally it will wear out the slide frame a little bit, and it might make it so that the slide lock does not work. in the future if you wear out that slide. It's never happened to me before, to be honest with you, but here's an older VFC Glock. If you notice there, it's a little bit chipped away right there because I've actuated the slide lock quite a bit, but that's not because I've released the slide lock. It's just because I fired it quite a bit, and when the magazine's out of ammo, it will lock back and there will just be wear and tear. So I don't really know if releasing the slide lock will cause that issue or not, the extra wear and tear, but it's just something I don't really do, but something to keep in mind though. Now, interestingly enough though, right, if you it still field strips the same way because it's a Glock, right, and all the internals are essentially basically the same. If you were to compare the internals of this Glock versus the Gen 4 G19 right here, basically, they didn't get too excited to redesign the internals, where not a lot of people would really be thinking, other than this one's blue piece right here. This is a black piece right there, both plastic. Spring guides look fairly similar, and then of course barrel and blowback housing units are all basically the same, which, although sounds lazy, right, it's actually more benefit, and it is, okay, but it is beneficial for you, the shooter, in the end, because spare parts are available. Whereas with the 9mm Glock out there, when they do these model upgrades, there are now parts compatibility issues. Like if they redesign the hammer, if they redesign the firing pin a little bit, you're not going to be able to use those aftermarket parts, or those parts that are already available that you might have. You're not going to be able to use them. So at least, yes, it's lazy, but at least you're going to be able to use some of those parts together. Now, what you can't use, and I'm sure it's quite obvious though, is the slide, right? Because if you were to use this old slide on the Gen 4 old slide onto this Gen slide, there's no cutout for the slide lock on the right-handed side. So you're not going to be able to actuate the lever because it's going to be blocking it, right? So you need to have that slide lock right there. But obviously you can slide the Gen 5 model into the Gen 4 frame. Okay, maybe you can't. We'll have to revisit that in a little bit, actually. I'll take that statement back, actually, because it looks like it's having some issues coming back on. But those are some of the internals. The internal parts do look very similar. I don't know why the slide itself just might not be compatible, but some of the parts, they're pretty much the same dimensions. Internal-wise, it pretty much looks the same except for certain things like their mag release, or sorry, the slide lock. If you'll notice, yeah, actually, sorry, the slides are not compatible. Just the design of it. Okay, real quick, let's move on now to the shooting of the gun. We want to see FPS wise. All right, before we go into the shooting and checking the FPS, I want to show the magazines. So again, not surprisingly, it's the same. This is a this is like the G17 magazine right here. Obviously it doesn't fit flush because it's a longer. This is a G19. This is a subcompact, or sorry, a compact. Whereas this one right here is a full-size magazine. But it fits the same. This is the magazine it came with right there. So not expecting a whole lot of differences right there. Let's see how the FPS are. Again, the internals are fairly the same across the board. They didn't really design a whole lot. I mean, I know that slide that we just found a hiccup there that I didn't expect, well, sort of expected, but not fully. You know what I mean. So anyway, let's try it out real quick. Let's see, I'm expecting around 300, 310 maybe. That's the typical ranges of all the WE Glocks, or at least the later generations. Alright, oops, that didn't really register. 316. Alrighty. 320. 320 again. 318. So it's pretty good. It's definitely really loud right now in the kitchen to be recording this, and it's echoing quite a bit, so we're going to stop there. But yeah, so I don't you know, again, since the internals are often the same, you know, you can expect the same thing you can expect from WE. And although I can't really give you an accurate sampling of how well this gun performs in terms of durability, we've seen in the past, you know, this is a WE right here. We've had plenty of WEs before. And again, they've all performed pretty well. The oldest one I've had was from 2017. Sorry, 2007. That's not old. I have one from 2012, and it's still working till today. G19. So it's still working. So WE, they you know, I think they've figured out how to make the Glocks work pretty well. So I'm not going to imagine that they've made any major modifications that would worsen the outcomes of this gun. One thing that I have noticed is that the barrel is an improvement. Now, when I say an improvement, I don't mean necessarily in terms of the materials, and it could be the materials. I hope it is too. If you remember way back, like, you know, 3-4 years ago, and maybe still today, I haven't read the forums lately, but WE is notorious for the barrel snapping after a couple thousand rounds. So there's a lot of pressure when you fire these guns on the neck of the barrel, and it snaps, blows right off, and the gun's now non-functional. And I haven't had that issue since coming on board. The first Glock I had was a G19. That's the same one I had from 2012, and that one, again, that barrel broke, but then I replaced the barrel with a new Garter barrel, and it never happened, never was an issue. Nothing else ever really broke that, you know, wasn't on purpose or by mistake, or sorry, by manufacturer defect. But since then, I bought quite a few other Glocks. This is a G19. I just happened to replace this barrel, but I have another one and a couple other ones, and they haven't really broke on me at all. And so I don't think it's a major issue anymore. And so I hope this pattern continues. But so maybe the materials have improved a bit. But I've noticed that typically, and I'll show you a close-up picture, but the barrel here seems a lot more quality. So it looks, sorry, not quality, but more rounded. Whereas in the, let me pull up a picture here. You'll notice that it's the WE one right here, the G19 is in the center, and it's a lot more rounded, and its edge looks more like the one next to it, right? The tan one right there on the left is the Stark Arms, right? Notice that's a little bit chunkier, it's a little more rounded, whereas the one on the right, the far right, that one's a WE one, and that one's actually, it looks kind of like jagged, it looks a little edgy, right? But so, you know, to me, I think that's kind of a big deal. I don't really like it when it's kind of edgy. I like it to be more the rounded one, kind of like the Elite, or sorry, the Stark Arms one on the way left side. But that's just a side note. Otherwise, the barrel material may or may not be the same as before, but again, it hasn't really been an issue. Of course, what's new in this model, of course, is the Trademarks on the top that mimics, as well as the caliber markings of 9x19 and this 30 and a 5, which I don't know what that is. All right. Anyway, that's basically the externals. One last thing I want to touch on is a lot of folks have been talking about this at the gun store. Basically, they'll talk about the new finishing on the Glock, and it does seem a little bit different compared to the earlier generations of the Glock, but I really can't tell if that was really by design or not, because this is a Gen 4 right here. This one carries with it a little bit kind of a grainier and a slightly different color than the Gen 5 right here. But I don't know, but I've bought other Glocks from WE, and they seem to have different texturing and slide feel, but it's a different generation. It was a Gen 3. So with this one, the Gen 5, it does feel slicker, and it does feel similar to the real steel, the 9mm counterpart. But again, I don't know if it's really designed or just by variation, you know, in terms of how the manufacturer decides to make them. Either way, though, you know, it does look a little bit different, and it does feel smoother from at least my model here. And it could be potentially because to mimic the official 9mm version. One last thing, I don't really know what this tab right here is for, but there is a tab where in the past there hasn't been any, so that's something that's kind of interesting right there. Otherwise, night sights look the same. oh, sorry, not the standard white dot sights and the U in the back, same standard Glock stuff. But that by and large, oh, and the magazine release. For some reason, even though this magazine release is the same basically as the Gen 4 one right here, it does seem that this one tends to, the Gen 4 one, I hold it with my left hand, and so as you can see, my middle finger kind of rests on this part right here. So sometimes when I run around, I do bump it a little bit, and if I hit something, it will drop the magazine out. Whereas I've noticed that hasn't really been the same issue with this one. For whatever reason, you know, it just seems, you know, like it doesn't happen. So that's an improvement, I think. But as far as the ease of release, it feels the same. So I don't really know why that is. When I'm pressing this one, you know, maybe it's my imagination at this point now, but it feels like it's, maybe this one's a little bit lighter. I don't know, but that's just something that I've kind of noticed. The trigger pull, the last thing I want to talk about, at least from an external review right here. A lot of folks will complain that Glock triggers are not the best to start with. And we're talking about serious shooters, competitive shooters. When they're shooting the 9mm version, they'll say that the Glock triggers aren't going to win any awards. They don't have these, what they call a crisp break. And what we mean by that is basically, do you know when that trigger is going to break? And when I say break, I mean like go off. So for example, if I hold this down, you know, I pull this trigger back, right? You'll notice there's some give, and then you're gonna hit a wall. And then a little bit further, if I pull a little bit further, I know that's when it's gonna fire, right? Bam, I know it. It's hard to explain that really, but there's a clean trigger break for the most part. And you'll know when that trigger pull is going to discharge around and when that trigger is going to break. But with Glocks, there's some folks that are kind of complaining, and it's mixed. It's a mixed bag right now. Some folks are complaining that there isn't a clean trigger, there isn't a clean wall, and the trigger is kind of described as what they say mushy. Obviously, since we're not firing, you know, real 9mm here, these are just 6mm rounds that we're firing. With propane, we're not as concerned. But here's the Gen 4. Again, the trigger pull, I don't know, it's the same. There's not really a huge difference, and I can't imagine there should be a huge difference in terms of the when the trigger breaks. So I don't think that's gonna apply in this case. But I try to look at it just for fun to see if they compare across the different generations. What is kind of cool though is, well, not cool, but so look at here. Notice how if I pull, let me see if I can fire some rounds here to demonstrate what I'm talking about. All right, so before we go into and demonstrate the trigger, one more thing, the thing about the trigger, I want to show one more thing before I forget. Notice how in this generation, the older generation, there are two pins that hold the kind of the internals down here together, and the trigger group pack. There's one right here. This one, these are real. This is an Elite Force one right here. And then on all the other models, they're kind of just fake. So this one right here, you'll see the real one, but then there's a fake hole right there. The Stark Arms, of course, everything's real in that one, so you'll see two as well. But of course, in the new one, the real Gen 5, the real steel, there's only one pin, and so they've replicated that pretty accurately. So no, they just didn't decide to get lazy and decide to not put a mold there. That's actually the real steel right there as well. All right, now back to the trigger. So the trigger pull, I don't expect anything big on that one. I'm not like a huge thing on that. I'm not like a competition shooter, so I'm not going to be able to tell that difference whether one trigger breaks is really more crisp than the other. To me, and to most shooters out there who use these, aren't probably gonna be able to tell the difference. But that's just my opinion on it, and I try to look at it just to see if there was, but I couldn't really tell a huge difference, and I don't think there is one. Okay, but there is a difference in terms of some function. So in this gun right here, this is the Gen 4 Glock. Notice how there's a safety, the famous Glock trigger safety right there. So if you pull on the side and not on the trigger, right, it won't break the trigger. It won't fire, is what I'm trying to say. But watch what happens when we put in a magazine and fire around, okay? So I'm going to fire around right now. Okay, so notice how the trigger has been reset it, and if I pull the trigger again, it will fire. But notice what happened to this trigger safety. It's no longer activated, right? Because it's tucked away. So you kind of, if I pull it again on the sides, it would actually start pulling back. So that's not good, right? So in order to really, once you fire it, it's kind of stuck in like an active mode. So that's because, you kind of cycle the slide back before you reset it, but it doesn't fully reset itself, basically. So in a way, you can kind of say that the old Glock triggers are a little bit mushy on just the WE version. I'm only talking to the WE. I'm not talking about the crispness of the break or anything like that. I'm just talking about the reset of the trigger safety. So again, since we have to pull the slide back a little bit and let it drop forward, it's now reset. And so if you try to pull on the side again without touching the trigger safety, it won't actuate. But that's just something to keep in mind. But that seems to be an improvement now with the newer version right here. So the Gen 5, right, knows how, again, the trigger safety is activated, right? So if I pull on the side without touching the trigger safety bar in the middle, it won't release or the trigger won't break, right? Now, just be careful, because when we're talking about trigger breaking, we're talking about the trigger being actuated, not the trigger actually breaking, as in like breaking off, right? If you pull hard enough and try to like really push back, obviously you're gonna break the trigger in the sense that mechanically break it. We gotta use a different word for that. All right, anyway, so let's see what happens here. So trigger safety is activated, magazine's in, let's fire a round. All right, notice how the trigger safety is still sticking out there, because if I try to pull it, it's still activated because there's a more crisp reset. Same thing, all right? So that's a huge improvement with the new Gen 5. All right, so that's basically it for now. I think that's a good preliminary overview of what to expect in terms of mainly just some basic looks, operations, but I really like it. I think this is a nice new development they made from WE. They did a really good job of doing it. They've taken the lessons they learned from their old Glocks and kind of applied it to this one. And in some cases, they fixed some of the new things like the trigger right here. So I think that's a good thing. There's a lot more to come from this. I can't, do everything in this video. This video is already by itself is too long. But this is just a kind of a preview of what's more to come. As we get more and more stuff from this, we'll make more videos in this. But I hope you all enjoy this content, and see y'all next time.